911, where's your emergency?
I'm up here to my daughter's house up on Cemetery Hill, and my own grandson is dead, and my daughter and her husband are in the bed, and I swear everywhere in there, and I'm not touching nothing.
Sir, how many people's deceased?
It looks like 3. I can't find the other 2. There's a 3-year-old and my 16-year-old. You know where they're at.
Any of them?
They were having some trouble out of Gavin. Issues with as far as like his temperament, and he's running around or running away. A lot had to do with that girl that he was running. She's a fruitcake.
When did Gavin get here?
A couple days ago.
Okay. So, a couple days ago being today's Sunday. What day was he up here? What day did he get?
I don't know the exact date, but it was about 5 days, I think. Well, today would have been the 5th day.
How could that be? Mama was here. She just left Friday. How could he dip her for 5 days? Did Mama know he was up here?
No, she didn't.
I'm trying to understand. You said he's been up for 5 days. How can that be?
You want to know the truth?
I do want to know the truth.
I know. Sorry. I know that you don't like him. I know that, but he's the only person that's really helped me through stuff. And look, I know it makes me. I know it's stupid. Okay, I know it, but he's the only person that makes me feel like I'm not alone. Because you guys made me feel like I'm alone. He's the only person that made me feel like I was something.
As Rebecca becomes more emotional and starts to talk more directly to her father, what we learn is that she's a teenager who's struggling. She's lonely, she's depressed, and Rebecca is clinging to this relationship because in her mind and in her teenage perspective on the world, Gavin's it.
What's amazing is that something absolutely horrible has happened. People have been brutally murdered, and her takeaway is that it's all about her. You guys did not make me feel special. He made me feel special. And there we begin to see the Romeo and Juliet story start to come together.
I know the answer to this, and so do you. But did he open up and tell you what he did?
Yes.
Good. What did he tell you? Did he say he shot him?
Yes.
What would drive him to do this stuff? Is it because he loved you so much?
Yes.
So, who all lives at the house with you?
My mom, my stepdad, my baby brother, and my younger brother.
Okay, what are all their names?
Gage is the youngest. Well, not the youngest, younger brother. James is the baby. Dan is the stepdad, and mom is the Weisha.
Okay.
All ISA. I can't pronounce how it's right.
We get introduced to Smith, and we find out a few things about him. Obviously, he has some sort of speech impediment, which in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of his intellectual or cognitive functioning, but can have significant repercussions in terms of his social life, in terms of how he was treated by fellow classmates.
And when he's asked about the people in his family, he talks about them in the third person. This is the baby, this is the stepfather, and this is the mother, as if he's talking about a story. Something outside his own family. There's no real attachment. There's just no emotion coming from this teenager.
Some of your family members are deceased. Okay. You know what that means? They're dead, right?
Yes, sir.
The detective is very clever. He says, some of your family members are dead. He doesn't say all. We never hear Smith say, who? Who's dead? Who's alive? He doesn't ask any of those questions. which is very odd. Not so odd if he knows the answer.
So what we're wanting is to get the truth from you about what happened at your house and how your family ended up dead, okay?
Dad, I don't know, but I know about the abuse.
Huh?
I said I didn't know about the decision, but I know about the abuse. My stepdad used to abuse me all the time if I didn't do something he wanted. And so would my mom.
He's not answering the question at all. He's front-loading his answer with excuses to try to justify what he's done. So that right there shows calculated thinking. He's thinking to try to reduce his culpability, and that's very psychopathic.
My stepdad, Dan, has been trying to kill me the past 2 days. He cut me right there.
Okay.
With a knife. And he's been just trying to kill me wherever he can.
Despite the fact that he knows his stepfather and mother and brothers have been dead for this period of time, he's saying that for the past 2 days, his stepfather's tried to kill him. He points to a place where he was sliced on his arm and there's no real wound there. Gavin is not worried about fact-checking. He's not worried about the credibility of what he's saying. Some of that we see in teenagers in general. They kind of engage in this magical thinking. But some of this is also consistent with what we see in psychopathic individuals who compulsively or pathologically lie.
Tell me about Daniel. What kind of guy was he?
He loved them boys. He loved racing. He was one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. I loved him to death. Dan was supposed to have a heart transplant.
Okay.
So he was only limited to what he could do because he couldn't get around and didn't have much wind.
I wonder why Gavin would be so angry to hurt Dan recently.
Unless he come and asked them to go up there, see her, and they would have told him no. And it broke her heart. All the times that Gavin would run away. Nobody understood why, but it always come back to that girl.
That to me is that she describes Walker as a boy-obsessed individual, and it seems like Walker's self-esteem, self-identity, and self-worth were very tied to a man's perception of her or whether or not she had a romantic partner.
Well, Gavin, what we're getting at is we talked to Rebecca, and you told Rebecca that you killed your family, okay?
I don't regret it.
You regret it?
No.
Who'd you shoot first?
Dan.
Okay. Where'd you shoot Dan?
In the head. I expected Mom in the head. Mom, Dan was in bed when I shot them.
Where was everybody else when you shot him?
Gage is, if I shot Gage, he went into the room and I shot him right there. And I had to kill Jay because Gage slit his throat right here.
Gage slit his throat? Why did Gage slit James' throat?
Because he kept on screaming. James kept on screaming, he won't calm down. And Gage couldn't take it, and he put a knife to James' throat and tried to slit it, and I shot Gage right there.
Okay. Well, why'd you shoot James?
I didn't really do it, but I didn't like seeing him in pain. I was at his crib when I shot him.
When Smith talks about how he killed his entire family, he does it as though he was describing what he had for breakfast. It's completely devoid of any of the associated emotions that you would expect.
And when we think about psychopathic individuals, oftentimes there's a lack of remorse, there's a lack of guilt, there's a willingness to just blame others, to stay superficial in their emotions and their attachment.
Well, Gavin, I don't think Gage cut Jameson's throat. I think you did.
I might have messed up, though. I'm not thinking straight. He didn't have to change, so I'm sorry.
Well, why did you tell us that to begin with?
I got mixed up.
That Gavin Smith just kind of rolls over and he flip-flops on his story and pretty immediately says, I got mixed up. I was the one that did all of this. There was nothing that Gavin Smith got mixed up about. He was quite clear and focused, and so much so that he shot 3 of the family members in the head, point blank, and then went to his baby brother's room, slit his throat, and then shot him in the head.
Did you tell anybody about what you were planning to do?
Well, I told her we'd back up. I told her I was going to kill them.
How long from when he showed up to when he actually told you what went down?
Well, he didn't tell me, like, when he got here. We was texting and all that, and he was FaceTiming. I knew that he was doing it. He had his gun in his hand.
And did he tell you why he was going to kill all of them? His reason?
His parents didn't like me for whatever reason. He wanted to just get rid of them so he could be with me.
This clip is incredibly disturbing in terms of showing us a glimpse of Rebecca Walker's mindset. She saw his hand on the gun as this was happening, and yet did nothing to intervene. So why would that be? Is she so frightened? Didn't seem that way. Could she have gone to the police? Of course. Could she have told her grandmother? Absolutely. But she tells you why at the end of the clip. Because she wanted him to be with her. And what greater power there is than to know that someone kills for you. So clearly, now Romeo and Juliet have become Bonnie and Clyde.
At any point, do you recall ever encouraging Gavin to hurt his family? Did you ever tell him to just blatantly say, Gavin, I want you to hurt or kill your family?
I did encourage it, yes, I did.
Was that in regard to specifically his stepdad and mom or everyone, or what did you mean when you said that?
Everyone.
And by everyone, you mean?
His whole family. I was saying to hurry up. That's what I was saying.
Why were you telling him to do that?
Because I wanted me and him to spend time together.
She not only knew about it, but she encouraged him to kill every member of his family. So we get a very, very disturbing picture of a young woman who feels that it's so important for her to be loved that she's willing to be complicit in multiple murders in order to prove that. Maybe she even kind of weaponized him. Maybe she was able to push him over the edge to do what she needed for her own self-esteem. He had nothing left, and yet she had all of him, and that's all she wanted. And that kind of thought process can only be described as psychopathic.
Last night you explained that you guys were basically, talking about killing his family for a whole entire week. So what started at the beginning of that week to make him start talking about that, or you start suggesting?
I have no idea. Other than him telling me that he was tired of his family keeping us from being together, and he wanted to hurt them. He was tired of the abuse he was going through, and he wanted to be with me, and that's why he wanted to do it.
What's really important to realize here is in Walker's own interrogation, she's not showing any emotions. She's not showing any concern.
911, where's your emergency?
I've been getting calls from my mother-in-law. My wife's not picking up the phone.
What's her name?
Jackie Wallace. I called her a bunch of times.
Okay, when's the last time you seen her?
Well, we got out of the lawyer today. We're going through a divorce, and I don't know if she's just not in.
Okay, where was she headed?
Home, I think. I mean, this ain't like her to go this long without following me.
When was the last time you saw her?
We went to lunch, and then we went to the lawyer at 3.
Tell me what time she actually left here.
I don't know. We got in an argument over this bankruptcy. It wasn't bad.
Okay. Did she say where she was going?
She took off walking.
Okay.
I've never seen her after that. Her car was gone.
Y'all got any kids together?
Yeah, I got triplets. 2 girls and a boy. Her parents are not right.
Did they talk to you?
Oh my God, trust me.
Okay.
Threats me, all kinds of stuff.
Okay. You know the address there?
No,
Okay.
Despite being law enforcement himself previously, Clay Waller didn't bother to call dispatch until he receives pressure from Jackie's family. Waller's lack of concern or urgency for locating his estranged wife, the mother of his triplets, who are only 5 years old, just makes his overall behavior suspicious.
So she left off on foot. Did you go try to look for her in your car then?
Yeah, I went down the hill. I didn't see her, and I went and got a soda to cool off.
My dad's a shady person. He always has been. I know he's going bankrupt. I know she was supporting him. If something bad happened, I think my dad did it. That's what I came in here to tell you guys.
Who's your dad's best friend?
My dad don't have no friends.
He's got to have somebody.
He has nobody.
What his son is starting to paint for us is a picture of somebody with a parasitic lifestyle mix where you're using other people. You're willing to live off of other people, and there's no real sense of adult responsibility or conscience to take care of yourself, to have a sense of integrity.
39-year-old Jackie Waller, formerly of Cape Girardeau, was last seen here on Woodland Drive in North Neal in Jackson.
Dozens of officers are now working this case. No one believes that this mother of 3 would just walk away from her children.
Wednesday, March 23rd, Clay called me at 7 a.m. He was threatening me and yelling at me. Met him at the airport. He told me that divorcing him was a death sentence. He would get me, and if he couldn't get to me, he would kill our kids. So, in this excerpt, you can see that there's just no regard for his having any real genuine affection for his own children. And just like all the characters in a psychopath's life, they're not other people who have feelings and interests and the ability to feel pain or anything else. They're simply characters in the story as they relate to the psychopath. And it's striking that even his young children that he later claims he cares so much about actually appear as just pawns for him to use as suits him in a particular situation.
When we look at journal entries like this, I think what this speaks to is a pattern of coercive, emotional abuse, physical threats, and he is doing what so many domestic abusers do. When they can't get to their partner, they use the children as a weapon, and they threaten to harm the children.
A new development in the Jackie Waller case. Investigators searching her estranged husband's rental have discovered blood spatter on 2 walls and that carpet had been removed.
The media's doing quite a number on me. We need to hear from you is what we need to do. We need your cooperation. I'm going to tell the story after it's all said and done. I'll tell it. What story? But until then, I'm just going to... What story? I'm going to just gonna keep my mouth shut. I don't have nothing to do with it. I haven't done anything. Okay. Explain the carpet, Clay. Explain Jackie's blood on the walls. Explain that to me right now. Hello? Clay.
Clay Waller says the community's out to get him. People spray painting killer on his truck.
I mean, it's been a hard time for us all.
Carpet and carpet pad hidden out of view in the back of a crawl space. One piece had a large blood stain that the crime lab confirmed contained Jackie Waller's DNA.
Clay, do you have any comment? He was arrested in Malden, Missouri on charges not related to his estranged wife's disappearance. He now faced a charge of stealing from a Cape Girardeau company.
What are they going to charge him with? So he just continues to taunt them. It's quite possible that this cat and mouse game isn't just Clay's hope to keep himself out of trouble. There's a secondary euphoria he's getting by thinking he's in charge. He's smarter than them.
I think his body language is telling. He's almost like stretched out, owning the entire interrogation room. He wants to show, I'm in control. You may think this is your interrogation, but really, I'm the one who's deciding which way we go.
I'm scared bloody no. It wasn't anything more than that.
That doesn't make sense. That happened. It happened because you have blood in the hall on the wall. How's that going to happen? That don't make any sense either, Clay. I don't know.
When he's confronted about the biological evidence, he doesn't even miss a beat. He doesn't hesitate to just insert another lie. If she had a nosebleed, if she tripped and hurt herself, why would you cut out the carpet in a rental? And then on top of that, he very covertly hid it so that it would be out of line of sight for anybody if they came through the house. Every step of the way, he has done what he can to hide and obstruct the process. His need for power and control and his narcissistic views of things far supersede any fear response he may have. And that's something we do see oftentimes in psychopathic individuals.
Cutting the carpet out? Yeah, it was not a big deal. The cop said I can clean up the house.
You can clean up, but that's not cleaning up. That's hiding something.
I didn't do that.
Then why not? Let me take the call.
Does it clear me after that? If you can't make that promise,
why does it have to be a promise? Is it about you or is it about Jack? Is it about you or is it about your kids? What's it about you? Is it only about you?
Don't get upset. We can end the conversation.
You ought to be happy that I get upset. My main concern is for Jack.
Well, go find her.
What I'm trying to do right here, buddy.
I don't know where she's at. And you're never going to get it out of me.
Never going to get it out of me. That would never be the answer. Why are you lying to me?
I'm not.
Yeah, you are. You are. You know you are, and I know you are.
If you guys know so much, figure it out. I don't know what to tell you. I had nothing to do with nothing.
You think you're really a lot smarter than you are.
Light at the end of the tunnel is going out for you. We're coming for you. And we're not going to rest. We don't need a body.
I don't give a in jail.
We're going to lock you up the rest of your life. What we're going to do to you.
Right.
Huh? Great. Yeah, you narcissistic bastard. That's why you think about yourself.
Nothing to do about it.
On Thursday morning, Clay Waller appeared in court regarding the alleged death threats he made to Jackie Waller's sister, Cheryl Brinicki, on the website Topics.
Jackie's sister got custody of the children, the triplets. So I think that what this represents is that Jackie's sister has basically become a proxy for Jackie. The narcissistic traits in psychopaths, you know, if they experience kind of anything that threatens their feeling of mastery, it's going to trigger anger, and they're prone to lash out with violence, with threats, things like that. This specific dynamic of someone is going to take the children away from me, that sets him off, and he directs thoughts of violence toward that person. So for the longest time, it was Jackie. Jackie's out of the picture. This is a very kind of clear substitute.
Somebody who's a domestic violence perpetrator, that need for control is far more intense than it is for most of us. And so it's important to realize that at this point, because we know after the fact that Clay has killed Jackie, he's hidden her body, nobody knows where it is, he's got to get that thrill-seeking, that arousal from somewhere. So continuing to jerk the police around is how he does that.
Waller pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a lesser charge.
You'd be remanded to the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections to serve a term of 20 years of imprisonment.
Clay Waller led investigators here to Devil's Island in Alexander County, Illinois, where they dug up Jackie Waller's remains.
In return, Mr. Waller had to provide the location of Jackie Waller's body, sit down, and give an accounting of how he killed Jackie Waller.
I was very calm. And I said, if you take those kids from me, Jack, I'm going to kill you. And I'm just going to rest my life in jail, just like that. My wife came to me in December. She said, I want a divorce. At that point in time, I wasn't concerned about her. Because I knew ultimately if she got those kids to where they were away from me, it was over. I knew it was over. And then she came in about May 1st and she said, I want to go and get a divorce. I said, okay. I knew he was going to die as soon as you did it.
So June 1st, you had your discussion with your attorney.
Her attorney. We get outside and she's like, you want to have one last bang before we make this final. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be a bang over there.
Alright. So then what happened?
And she went to the refrigerator. I shot in there to get a Reese's peanut butter cup. I raised up and I hit her nose. She started bleeding. And she took off running. And she tripped. She tripped it. And she made off the cuff of Mark. She said, I need to go tell the attorney that you just beat me up. I'm like, beat you up? Face. I stood over and I punched her right in the nose. She started bleeding profusely. And then she was starting to thrash around. She just like, this hurts. And then blah, blah, blah. So I just took my forearm. Just pressed into her neck. She stopped moving.
essentially. He states that it was Jackie's fault that she was killed. He said, I warned her, as if a threat that he acted on to kill her is in any way valid. But on top of that, he explains how he looked her in the eye as he was killing her, and he just didn't feel anything bad because he warned her, and so he's absolved of any type of guilt or responsibility.
She was too heavy to move. So then I went, there was a trash can sitting right here, and I load her in that trash can, and then I take it out, and I take it over here.
Okay, so you put the can containing Jackie in the back of your truck?
Yeah.
He had just committed murder, and his wife is now dead. The children that he has with her are now motherless, and he's complaining about her body being too heavy. Even then, he's saying it in such a way that the only real emotion he shows is for himself.
I got the boat out, which was difficult because it was mud and water was not very deep.
Okay, and you go up the river? It's on the Illinois side, just south of Devil's Island Chute.
Yeah.
What day did you dig the hole that you buried her in?
The day before.
The day before? So May 31st?
Very gently pulled her out, placed her in the hole, and I told her just all I wanted was my family. Or something along those lines. That's what I told her.
While Waller is describing the details of what actually happened the day he killed Jackie, there are moments where he sounds like it was this impulsive act, but he dug the hole before. He knew she signed her death warrant the minute she didn't back down on the...
At 6:42 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet Sydney suburb, the kind of street where nothing ever happens and people believe the past stays buried. But that morning the voice on the line was tight, rehearsed, and shaking, and before the receiver was put down, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever disappeared in 1995 had never really gone away. It started with a missing woman, or at least that was how the headlines framed it back then, a single line buried on page 6 of the local paper, a name that meant everything to one family and nothing to the city at large, 34 years old. Last seen leaving her home on a humid January evening. No signs of struggle, no witnesses who could agree on what they saw, and no reason, at least on paper, for her to vanish without a trace. Sydney moved on quickly. The beach was full the next morning. Traffic still snarled along Parramatta Road. The city swallowed the story whole. But inside the house she never returned to, time froze. The front door was unlocked when police arrived, the television still humming with late-night static, a half-drunk glass of water sweating onto the kitchen counter, and a handbag resting on the chair where she always left it, wallet inside, keys missing, phone gone. As if she had stepped out for 5 minutes and somehow slipped through a crack in the world. Officers photographed everything, measured nothing that seemed worth measuring, and told the family the words they would hear again and again in the weeks to come. No immediate evidence of foul play. That phrase would become a wound that never healed. Neighbors remembered fragments, nothing solid, a woman arguing on the phone earlier that day, a car idling too long near the curb, footsteps in the dark that might have belonged to anyone, and by the time detectives began knocking on doors, memories had already started to soften, blur, rewrite themselves. Sydney in the mid-90s was busy, loud, expanding fast, and missing adults did not stop its momentum. Within days, the case slipped from urgent to concerning. Within weeks, it was labeled a cold case in waiting. The family refused that label. They searched the coastline, walked the parks, taped flyers to lampposts already crowded with ads for lost pets and guitar lessons, and every night they sat around the same kitchen table, staring at the same empty chair, replaying the last conversation, the last goodbye. The last ordinary moment that now felt criminally careless. Police followed procedure, ran checks, interviewed acquaintances, examined bank records that showed no activity, passports that remained untouched, and when the trail went quiet, so did the investigation. Officially, she was missing. Unofficially, she was gone. Years passed. The house changed hands. New families moved in. The flyers faded, peeled, disappeared, and the case file slid deeper into a metal cabinet, its edges yellowing, its contents outdated, its importance shrinking with every new crime that demanded attention. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. The city forgot. But secrets have a way of surviving neglect. In 2004, a tip came in anonymous, vague, almost insulting in its lack of detail, claiming the answer had always been closer than police wanted to admit. It was logged, assigned a number, and quietly dismissed. In 2010, another call suggested the family knew more than they were saying. Investigators listened, took notes, and did nothing. The case was technically still open, but in practice, it had become a ghost story told in low voices, a warning to young officers about the danger of chasing shadows. Then, in 2023, everything changed. A routine review of unresolved files flagged the case for re-examination, not because of new evidence, but because of a pattern, a series of cold cases from the same decade, the same suburbs, the same uncomfortable feeling that something fundamental had been overlooked. Boxes were pulled. Statements reread. Photographs scanned into modern systems. And for the first time in decades, someone noticed what had always been there. The family timeline didn't line up. Small discrepancies, easy to miss, a dinner remembered at different times, a phone call placed slightly earlier than claimed, a neighbor's account that contradicted a sibling's version by just enough to matter. And when investigators began laying those details side by side, the image they formed was no longer one of random disappearance, but of careful omission. The house was searched again, not physically, but historically, floor plans compared to renovation permits, old insurance documents retrieved, utility records examined for anomalies that no one had thought to question in 1995. And then came the interview requests. One by one, family members were called in, older now, slower to speak, but burdened by something that time had not eased, and as the questions grew more precise, the atmosphere shifted, answers became clipped, rehearsed, defensive, and the word lawyer entered the room more than once. Police said nothing publicly. The media noticed anyway. By the time the headline broke, it didn't read missing woman or new lead or even cold case reopened. It read something far more unsettling. Sydney 1995 cold case, closed, family secret exposed after decades. Closed did not mean resolved. Closed did not mean justice. It meant the truth had finally been named. According to investigators, the disappearance was never a mystery to everyone involved, only to the public, only to the city that kept moving while a private agreement of silence hardened into habit. And the house that once felt empty now felt complicit. No body was ever recovered. No dramatic confession aired on the evening news. Just a quiet statement, carefully worded, confirming that the case would no longer be treated as a missing persons investigation. The shock rippled outward. Neighbors who remembered the flyers felt sick. Journalists dug through archives with fresh urgency. Online forums lit up with speculation, anger, disbelief, and one question echoed louder than all the rest. How could something like this hide in plain sight for so long? Because families, police would later say, are good at protecting themselves. Because the past, when ignored long enough, learns how to blend in. Because cold cases don't stay cold on their own. And as Sydney absorbed the news, the unease settled in, heavy and unresolved, because even now, with the file marked closed, the most important piece was still missing, and the silence left behind was louder than any answer ever given. The first mistake investigators made in 1995 was believing silence meant nothing had happened, because in that house, silence had been carefully constructed, layered, reinforced year after year until it sounded natural. Until it sounded like grief. Until it sounded like the absence of answers rather than the presence of a secret. When detectives reopened the file decades later, they didn't begin with the disappearance itself. They began with the days that followed, the strange calm that settled over the family once the initial panic passed, the way interviews ended quickly, the way certain questions were deflected with practiced sorrow, and how no one ever pushed hard enough to fracture the story. Back then, police were trained to look outward, towards strangers, predators, unknown vehicles, not inward, not toward the people who had the most to lose. The original statements read smoothly, too smoothly, a family united in confusion, each memory fitting neatly against the next, and yet when modern investigators placed those same statements side by side, digitized, time-stamped, analyzed for linguistic patterns, the seams began to show. Certain phrases repeated verbatim across different interviews, identical wording that suggested rehearsal rather than recollection. Emotional spikes appeared where they didn't belong. Long pauses were transcribed as ellipses and forgotten until someone finally asked why they were there at all. On the night she vanished, the family said everyone was home. Dinner was late. Tempers were short. Nothing unusual. That version held for nearly 30 years, until a single overlooked phone record surfaced, a landline call placed at 9:17 p.m., lasting just under 2 minutes, dialed from inside the house to a number that belonged to no friend, no workplace, no service provider. In 1995, the call was logged but never pursued. In 2023, it became a fault line. Investigators traced the number to a payphone less than a kilometer away, one that had since been removed, its metal shell sold for scrap, its location now occupied by a convenience store. The implication was subtle, but devastating. Someone inside the house had called ahead, arranged something, signaled a moment. The question was who and why. As interviews resumed, old dynamics resurfaced. A sibling who had always spoken too much now said almost nothing. A parent who once cried openly became rigid, technical, choosing words with legal precision. The house itself became part of the interrogation, its layout recreated in 3 dimensions, rooms measured not just for size but for sound, for visibility, for how easily a raised voice could travel or be contained. One detail kept returning, like a stubborn echo: the back room. In every renovation record, it appeared slightly altered, walls adjusted, floors replaced, electrical work redone without clear explanation. Contractors from the late 90s were located, some cooperative, some evasive, one finally admitting that a section of flooring had been removed and replaced under unusual circumstances, paid for in cash, no questions asked. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Police didn't dig. Not physically. There was no warrant, no probable cause strong enough to justify tearing apart a house that had changed hands twice since the disappearance. Instead, they dug through time, through receipts, schedules, memories no one expected to be questioned again. They asked why renovations happened when they did. Why that room? Why that urgency? The answers came slowly, reluctantly, inconsistently. And then there was the witness who never testified. In the original case file, buried beneath administrative notes, was a reference to a teenage neighbor who claimed to hear shouting late that night, followed by a sudden, unnatural quiet. In 1995, the statement was deemed unreliable. Teenagers misremember. Teenagers exaggerate. The neighbor moved away. The lead died. Until someone found him again. Now middle-aged, with a family of his own, he remembered more than anyone expected. He remembered the sound, not just yelling, but something heavy striking something hollow. He remembered lights switching on and off in rapid succession. He remembered thinking, even then, that it didn't feel like an argument, it felt like an ending. He never came forward again because no one asked him to. He assumed the police knew more than they did. They didn't. The case, once dormant, began to tighten, like a knot pulled too fast, too late. Prosecutors were consulted. Language shifted. Words like disappearance were quietly replaced with suspected homicide, though never in public statements. The family sensed the change immediately. Lawyers were retained. Doors closed. Cooperation became conditional. And still no body. Still no confession. Still, nothing the public could point to and call proof. That was the most disturbing part. Because what police were building wasn't a case meant for court. It was a conclusion meant for truth, for record, for history. They were assembling certainty without spectacle, acknowledging that sometimes justice arrives stripped of drama, offering only clarity and discomfort in its place. The announcement, when it came, was deliberately restrained. No arrests. No charges. Just a declaration that the investigation had determined the disappearance was not voluntary, not random, not the work of an unknown offender. The responsibility, it said, lay within the family circle. Further details would not be released. The city reacted the way it always does when certainty arrives without satisfaction. Talkback radio exploded. Headlines sharpened. Armchair detectives filled comment sections with accusations and theories. Some demanded names. Others demanded punishment. Many refused to believe that a case could be closed without handcuffs, without a grave, without a moment of reckoning broadcast live. But those closest to the truth understood what the closure really meant. It meant the weight had shifted. It meant the silence no longer belonged only to the missing. It meant the secret, once shared by few, now belonged to everyone. Inside the family, relationships fractured along invisible lines. Those who had known carried guilt like a second spine. Those who hadn't felt betrayed twice, first by the disappearance, then by the years of deception that followed. Holidays became impossible. Conversations collapsed under their own history. No one emerged unmarked. And somewhere in Sydney, the place where it all began continued its routine, traffic lights blinking, waves breaking, strangers passing each other without knowing how close they were to a story that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. The cold case was closed. But the questions it left behind refused to rest. Because when a truth survives this long without daylight, it doesn't fade when finally exposed. It stains. It lingers. It waits. And in the spaces where answers should have been, something far colder took their place. What unsettled investigators most wasn't what the family said when the case reopened, but what they no longer bothered to deny, because denial requires energy, and after nearly 3 decades of holding the same shape, the truth had begun to sag under its own weight. The deeper detectives went, the clearer one pattern became. Nothing about that night was impulsive. Whatever happened inside that house in 1995 unfolded within a framework already prepared. Not a crime of sudden rage spilling into chaos, but a rupture quickly contained, managed, and quietly folded into daily life. The kind of act that doesn't end when the shouting stops, but continues in paperwork, in explanations, in carefully chosen silences. In the original investigation, officers had asked who last saw her alive. In the reopened file, they asked something else entirely, who benefited from her absence. Financial records, once dismissed as irrelevant, were examined with forensic precision. An insurance policy adjusted months before the disappearance. A will quietly updated. Joint accounts reorganized within weeks, justified as necessity, framed as survival. None of it illegal on its own. All of it suspicious when viewed as a sequence rather than isolated facts. One transaction stood out, small but precise, a transfer that occurred the morning after she vanished, routed through an account belonging to a family member who claimed to be asleep until midday. In 1995, banks didn't flag it. In 2023, algorithms did. Investigators didn't accuse. They asked for an explanation. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, and contradicted a prior statement given decades earlier. That contradiction was never corrected. The interviews grew longer. The tone shifted. Detectives stopped filling silences. They let them stretch, let discomfort do the work, and in those quiet moments, body language spoke louder than words. Eyes darted. Hands clenched. Breathing changed when certain names were mentioned, when certain rooms were described, when the timeline narrowed to a window of less than 90 minutes, the space where the official story could no longer hold. One investigator would later describe it as watching a dam leak, not collapse, just a steady, irreversible seepage. Outside the interview rooms, pressure mounted. The media sensed blood in the water, even without details, and every recycled headline carried the same implication. The danger had never been outside the home. Journalists revisited old footage, grainy images of a family standing together on a front lawn, pleading for help, voices breaking on cue, and now those images played differently. Not as desperation, but as performance. Former detectives from the 90s were contacted. Some defended the original work. Others admitted, off the record, that the case had always felt wrong, too tidy, too cooperative. One retired officer said something that echoed through the task force like a confession of its own. When families don't fight you, you stop fighting them. That realization came too late. As the review continued, investigators faced a familiar limitation, one that defines so many cold cases: the absence of a body. Without remains, without a crime scene preserved in time, the law demanded restraint. Suspicion could be stated. Conclusions could be reached. But prosecution required a certainty that time had already eroded. So police did what they could still do. They reconstructed the night. Using archived weather data, they confirmed the heat, the kind that amplifies irritation, the kind that turns minor disputes into flashpoints. Using phone records, they mapped movements inside the house, the sequence of calls, the gaps where nothing was recorded and everything might have happened. Using witness recollections, they layered sound onto space: footsteps, voices, sudden quiet. The picture that emerged was claustrophobic. An argument escalating behind closed doors. A moment where control was lost. An injury that wasn't meant to be fatal, but became irreversible. And then the shift, the moment panic hardened into decision. What followed was not chaos. It was coordination. The payphone call. The rearranged timeline. The renovation. The years of collective silence. Each step small enough to explain away, together forming something impossible to ignore. When confronted with this reconstruction, no one confessed. They didn't need to. Their responses said enough. "I don't remember," replaced earlier certainty. "I assumed someone else handled that," became a shield. Responsibility dissolved into ambiguity, passed from one family member to another until it vanished entirely. This, investigators realized, was the final layer of protection, diffusion. If everyone is partly responsible, no one can be fully accused. The announcement that followed was carefully engineered to withstand scrutiny. Police acknowledged that evidence supported a conclusion of unlawful death occurring within the family residence, perpetrated by one or more individuals known to the victim. They stated that due to the passage of time and lack of recoverable remains, no charges would be laid. The case would be closed. The word "closed" landed like an insult. For the public, it felt like surrender. For the family, it felt like exposure. For investigators, it felt like the only honest ending left. Because cold cases do not resolve the way people want them to. They don't end with flashing lights and courtroom speeches. Sometimes they end with a line drawn through a file and a quiet understanding that justice, delayed long enough, becomes something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, the family withdrew completely. Social media accounts disappeared. Addresses changed. Phone numbers disconnected. They didn't issue statements or deny allegations. Silence, once again, became their refuge. But this time, it was different. This time, the silence was loud. Neighbors talked. Former friends distanced themselves. Children grew up under a shadow they didn't choose, inheriting a story that would follow them into schools, workplaces, relationships. The secret that had once protected the family now isolated it, marking them as something untouchable, unresolved. And the city watched, unsettled, because the case forced an uncomfortable reckoning. How many other stories like this were hidden behind closed doors, disguised as normalcy, buried not by incompetence or lack of evidence, but by trust misplaced and questions unasked? Sydney continued to move, as cities always do, but beneath the rhythm of daily life, something had shifted. A recognition that the most dangerous mysteries are not the ones that leave traces in alleys or parks, but the ones that settle into homes, rearrange furniture, and learn how to wait. The cold case was closed. The truth was known. And still, at night, when the streets grew quiet, the absence remained, unresolved, unburied, a presence shaped like a person who never walked out of that house and never will. By the time the case was officially labeled closed, investigators already understood the cruel irony at its core. The truth had survived not because it was strong, but because it was shared. Parceled out in fragments small enough for everyone involved to carry without collapsing under the weight of it. In 1995, the family had acted quickly, not with panic, but with instinct sharpened by proximity. They knew the house. They knew the rhythms of the street, the neighbors who slept with windows open, the ones who worked night shifts, the hours when noise melted into background hum. What they did next was not documented in reports or transcripts, but its outline was visible in everything that followed, in decisions that only made sense when viewed as damage control rather than grief. Police reviewing the case decades later began to focus less on what happened during the argument and more on the minutes immediately after, the moment when shock either paralyzes or mobilizes. According to their reconstruction, this family chose the latter. Someone made the call from the landline. Someone left the house briefly, long enough to be seen by no one who remembered it clearly. Someone else stayed behind, ensuring the interior looked untouched, ordinary, unchanged. That ordinariness became the greatest deception. When officers first walked through the house, they saw no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood visible to the naked eye. In the 90s, forensic standards were narrower, tools slower, assumptions easier. An argument without witnesses was just that. An injury without a body was hypothetical. The absence of obvious violence was interpreted as absence of violence altogether. Years later, that assumption collapsed. Modern forensic consultants examined photographs taken the night she disappeared, images once considered routine, and noticed subtle inconsistencies: a rug slightly misaligned, a chair angled away from the table in a way that suggested sudden movement, a faint discoloration near the baseboard that could have been anything, or could have been something washed too thoroughly. Nothing conclusive. Everything suggestive. And then there was the smell. In the original notes, one officer had written a single line, easy to overlook: strong cleaning odor throughout rear section of house. At the time, it was dismissed as nerves, a family scrubbing in response to stress. Decades later, that line took on a different meaning. Cleaning as erasure. Cleaning as panic disguised as order. Investigators began tracking purchases made in the days following the disappearance. Cleaning supplies bought in bulk. Plastic sheeting. A rented utility vehicle returned early, mileage logged but never questioned. Each receipt alone was harmless. Together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Still, none of it crossed the threshold required for charges. This was the wall time builds around crimes at shelters long enough. The task force knew they were racing not against suspects, but against decay of memory, of material, of legal possibility. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Others no longer trusted their own recollections. Even if someone decided to speak now, to confess, to unburden themselves, the prosecution would face a jury asked to believe a story with no body, no scene, no physical proof untouched by decades of uncertainty. And yet, the truth pressed forward anyway. In one interview, a family member slipped, not with words, but with emotion. When asked where she thought the victim was now, the response came instantly, without hesitation, without hope: she's not coming back. Not I fear, not I think, but certainty, naked and unguarded. The room went quiet. The question was repeated. The answer didn't change. That moment was logged, flagged, discussed late into the night by investigators who understood what it meant. You don't mourn that way unless mourning has already been completed. Outside the investigation, the city's relationship with the case shifted again. What began as shock curdled into unease, then something closer to complicity. People asked themselves how easily they had accepted the original narrative, how quickly they had looked away, how often the phrase family tragedy had been allowed to substitute for scrutiny. Talkback radio hosts framed it as betrayal. Columnists called it a failure of the system. Online, strangers argued over blame, over whether naming the family without charges was ethical, over whether closure without justice was worse than silence. The debate itself became part of the case's legacy, proof that unresolved crimes don't end, they migrate, moving from courtrooms into culture, from files into memory. For the family, the exposure was suffocating. They had lived for years believing that time had buried the past deep enough to make it inert. Instead, time had preserved it, fossilized it, kept it intact until the right tools existed to extract it again. Relationships within the family collapsed under the strain of shared guilt and unequal knowledge. Those who had known everything resented those who had known only part. Those who had known nothing felt used, manipulated, robbed of the right to grieve honestly. And still, no one spoke publicly. The absence of a confession became its own statement. Investigators closed the file knowing it would never truly close. They archived the documents, sealed certain transcripts, and moved on to the next case, carrying with them the quiet frustration that defines this kind of work. Because some crimes are solved not by proving who did it, but by understanding why no one could ever say it out loud. The house where it happened still stands, renovated again, its history invisible to passers-by. New occupants sleep under the same roof, unaware of the exact shape of what once unfolded there, feeling only the faint, unplaceable discomfort that lingers in spaces shaped by violence and denial. And somewhere within the city's collective consciousness, the story has settled into a new form, not a mystery anymore, but a warning. A reminder that cold cases are not always frozen because evidence is missing. Sometimes they are cold because everyone involved agreed to keep them that way. The file is marked closed. The secret is exposed. But the silence, refined over decades, remains. Waiting. Breathing. Unfinished. The most unsettling realization came after the file was closed, after the statements were archived and the press cycle began to thin, because that was when investigators finally had the distance to see the case not as a sequence of failures, but as a demonstration of how easily truth can be managed when everyone involved agrees on what must never be said. In the months following the announcement, fragments of the story continued to surface, not through official channels, but through people who had lived close enough to the family to feel the tension without understanding it. Former friends recalled sudden cutoffs, invitations canceled without explanation, a sense that something had gone wrong long before the disappearance, but had never been named. A coworker remembered a conversation weeks before that night, a moment of visible fear quickly masked as exhaustion. At the time, it registered as nothing. Now, it felt like a warning that arrived too early to be understood. Investigators revisited these peripheral voices, not to reopen the case, but to complete the narrative for themselves. They wanted to understand how the secret had functioned socially, how it had shaped behavior without ever revealing its source. What they found was a network of subtle accommodations, people unconsciously adjusting around a tension they couldn't identify, giving space, avoiding certain topics, accepting vague explanations because pressing further felt impolite. Silence, they realized, had accomplices. The family's internal structure, once examined through this lens, revealed a hierarchy that explained everything and nothing at once. Decisions were centralized. Information was rationed. Younger members learned early which questions ended conversations and which stories were safest to repeat. Over time, that discipline became instinct. By adulthood, they no longer remembered choosing silence. It simply felt like loyalty. This was how the secret survived. One investigator described it as a closed ecosystem, self-correcting, punishing deviation not with threats, but with emotional withdrawal, with the quiet understanding that speaking would cost more than staying silent ever could. In that environment, the truth didn't need to be hidden aggressively. It hid itself. Even so, cracks appeared. In 2016, years before the case was formally reviewed, a family member reportedly sought counseling under a false name, describing recurring dreams of confined spaces, of cleaning something that wouldn't come clean. of standing in a doorway while something irreversible happened behind them. The therapist, bound by confidentiality and lacking context, treated it as trauma without a source. It wasn't until much later that investigators learned of the sessions at all, and by then, they were nothing more than echoes. Echoes were all this case had left. The absence of a body became more than an obstacle. It became a presence of its own, shaping every conversation, every public reaction. People demanded to know where she was, what had been done with her, how a city could accept closure without remains. Police never answered directly. They couldn't. But privately, many believed the same thing. Whatever happened to her had been intended to erase her completely, not just from life, but from consequence. That intention failed. Because erasure leaves patterns. As the city absorbed the implications, something else shifted, quieter but no less significant. Other families with unresolved disappearances came forward, not with new evidence, but with renewed urgency. They saw in this case a reflection of their own fear, that the truth might exist without justice, that answers could arrive stripped of accountability. Advocacy groups criticized the language used by police, arguing that closed, without prosecution risked normalizing impunity. Legal scholars debated whether transparency without charges served the public interest or merely re-traumatized those involved. The case had become a fault line. For the family, life narrowed. Employment became difficult. Associations ended abruptly. Children were shielded from questions adults couldn't answer themselves. The secret, once a shared burden, became a social stigma, something that followed them into spaces where no one mentioned it directly, but everyone knew. And still, no one spoke. What investigators understood, but never stated publicly, was that the silence no longer protected anyone. It had outlived its function. There was no legal threat left to avoid, no investigation left to obstruct. What remained was something older and harder to dismantle: identity. Admitting the truth now would mean dismantling an entire self-concept built over decades, acknowledging not just a crime, but a life shaped around its concealment. That kind of confession is rare. Late one evening, a senior detective involved in the review returned to the street where the house once stood, parked across from it, and sat there longer than necessary. He later said it wasn't about the case anymore. It was about the feeling that something had been resolved incorrectly, not factually, but morally. That the system had done all it could, and still, something essential was missing. Justice, perhaps. Or accountability. Or simply the sound of someone finally saying what everyone else already knew. The city would never hear that sound. Instead, the case would persist as a lesson whispered through training rooms and investigative briefings, a reminder that not all crimes announce themselves with violence and chaos, that some wear the face of normalcy and ask only to be believed. It would be cited as an example of why cold cases should never be treated as dormant, why familiarity must never replace skepticism, why silence should always be questioned, especially when it comes from those closest to the center. Sydney moved on, but differently now, carrying an unease that settled beneath the surface of daily life. The beaches were still full. Traffic still clogged the roads. Houses still changed hands. But the idea that something so profound could be hidden for so long changed how people listened, how they trusted, how they interpreted absence. The cold case was closed. The secret was exposed. And yet, somewhere between what was known and what would never be said, the truth continued to exist in its most dangerous form, acknowledged, unpunished, and unresolved. A reminder that some endings arrive quietly, and some silences never end. Long after the file was stamped closed and shelved, the case continued to move, not forward, but inward, settling into the people who had touched it, shaping how they slept, how they listened, how they learned to recognize the difference between what is said and what is carefully avoided. For investigators, the afterlife of the case was the hardest part. There were no more interviews to conduct, no warrants to request, no evidence left to test. Just the lingering awareness that they now carried a truth they were not allowed to fully articulate. In briefings and internal discussions, the case was referred to in shorthand, A shared understanding passed between professionals who knew exactly what it meant when someone said, "The Sydney 95 file." It became a reference point, a quiet cautionary tale about proximity and blindness, about how familiarity dulls suspicion until suspicion disappears altogether. Some detectives began to question older cases with new intensity, revisiting assumptions they once accepted without resistance. Others struggled with a more personal reckoning, wondering how many times they had mistaken cooperation for innocence, how often they had confused calm for grief rather than control. The case didn't just close a chapter. It rewrote margins in dozens of others. For the community, the shift was slower but no less profound. People who had lived nearby in the 90s replayed memories they once dismissed as trivial. A raised voice overheard through an open window. A late-night vehicle they never saw again. A sudden renovation that felt excessive at the time but polite not to question. These fragments, once harmless, now carried weight, and with that weight came guilt, the uncomfortable sense that something had been missed not because it was hidden well, but because no one wanted to see it. The story entered local folklore, retold in fragments at dinner tables, in classrooms, in online threads where strangers tried to impose order on something that resisted it. Each retelling sharpened certain details and blurred others. The argument, the phone call, the back room. Over time, the real case began to coexist with a shadow version shaped by speculation, fear, and imagination. That shadow grew louder than the facts themselves. For the family, the consequences arrived quietly but relentlessly. Jobs ended without explanation. Invitations stopped coming. Old friends avoided eye contact in public spaces. Even those who believed no crime could be proven felt the shift, the way trust evaporates once doubt has been named out loud. They learned that closure for the public often means exile for the people at the center. Inside the family, silence no longer functioned as protection. It became a wedge. Members who had once shared the burden evenly now resented each other for how that burden had been distributed. Some felt they had sacrificed their entire lives to maintain a secret they never agreed to keep. Others clung to the belief that speaking now would only destroy what little remained. Conversations ended abruptly. Long-standing alliances fractured. The past, once locked away, now occupied every room. And still, no one spoke. Psychologists consulted by the review team described the phenomenon as moral freezing, a state in which individuals remain emotionally fixed at the moment of trauma, unable to move forward because doing so would require acknowledging an act too destabilizing to integrate. In such cases, time does not heal. It preserves. The longer the silence lasts, the more dangerous speech becomes, not legally, but psychologically. This explained why, even when the risk of prosecution had faded, confession did not follow. The absence of remains continued to haunt every discussion. Without a body, grief had no physical anchor. There was no grave to visit, no ritual to complete, no proof to silence doubt. The missing woman existed only in memory and inference, a presence defined by what could not be shown. For her extended family, this was a second disappearance, the erasure not just of a person, but of the right to mourn openly. Advocates argued that this was the true cost of unresolved cases, not just the failure of justice, but the theft of closure from those left behind. They pointed to Sydney 1995 as an example of how legal finality can coexist with emotional limbo, how a case can be officially over while remaining profoundly unfinished. The city absorbed these arguments without consensus. Some accepted the police conclusion as the best possible outcome under the circumstances. Others rejected it outright, convinced that naming responsibility without consequence was a betrayal of the very idea of justice. The divide hardened, and the case became shorthand for a larger unease, the fear that truth alone is not enough. At night, in the neighborhoods surrounding the original house, the story took on a quieter life. People drove past without knowing why they slowed. New residents felt an unspoken discomfort they couldn't explain. The space carried no markers, no plaques, no warnings, just the faint residue of something unresolved, the kind of atmosphere that settles where certainty has been denied for too long. Investigators knew this feeling well. It was the same sensation that lingered after every cold case review, the knowledge that understanding does not always arrive with resolution, that sometimes all you can do is name what happened and accept that the system has limits no amount of effort can erase. In private moments, some asked themselves whether closing the case had been an act of courage or concession, whether exposing the truth without punishment served the public or merely confirmed its cynicism. There were no clear answers, only the awareness that leaving the case open would have been a lie, and closing it was an imperfect truth. The cold case was closed. The secret was acknowledged. And the city learned, slowly and uncomfortably, that some truths do not heal wounds. They simply prevent them from being ignored. In the absence of justice, what remained was memory. In the absence of confession, what remained was inference. And in the absence of a body, what remained was a question that would never fully release its grip. Not because it lacked an answer, but because the answer arrived too late to matter in the way people needed it to. What no one anticipated was how the case would begin to surface in places far removed from police briefings and newsrooms, how it would seep into ordinary conversations, professional decisions, and private fears, becoming less a story about one disappearance and more a mirror held up to the idea of trust itself. Years earlier, before the review, the family had been regarded as quiet, reserved, perhaps a little closed off, but fundamentally unremarkable. After the announcement, that same restraint was reinterpreted as calculation. Ordinary behaviors acquired new meanings. A refusal to speak publicly was no longer grief, but avoidance. A lack of visible anger became evidence of control. The same facts, rearranged by context, told a radically different story. This was how reputations ended, not with proof, but with implication. Former colleagues distanced themselves, not out of certainty, but out of discomfort. It was easier to step away than to hold space for ambiguity. Friends who had once defended the family found themselves questioned by others, forced to explain loyalties that now felt naive. Even those who believed the police conclusion was insufficient felt compelled to choose a side, because neutrality itself began to look like denial. The case didn't ask for judgment. It demanded it. In academic circles, criminologists began referencing Sydney 1995 in lectures and papers, not as an example of investigative failure, but as a study in collective silence. They examined how social bonds can obstruct truth, how shared narratives can override evidence, how the absence of conflict can be mistaken for the absence of crime. The case became a cautionary footnote, a reminder that proximity to a victim does not guarantee clarity, and proximity to suspects does not guarantee suspicion. The idea unsettled students and professionals alike, because it suggested that the most dangerous crimes are not committed by strangers who vanish into the night, but by people who stay, who attend holidays, who grow old, who carry on, and in doing so, normalize the unthinkable. For the family, the pressure intensified in unpredictable ways. Private moments were no longer private. A trip to the grocery store became an exercise in vigilance. Conversations lowered when they entered a room. Children sensed tension they couldn't name, inheriting a stigma without understanding its origin. The secret that had once lived behind walls now followed them everywhere, a shadow cast by something never fully spoken. Within the family, fractures widened. Accusations were never voiced directly, but they didn't need to be. Everyone understood where suspicion rested, and that understanding poisoned even the most mundane interactions. Shared meals became rare. Celebrations disappeared. The silence that once unified them now isolated them from one another. It was in this environment that one family member came closest to breaking. According to sources familiar with the review, an individual contacted police indirectly, through an intermediary, asking questions framed as hypotheticals, probing the boundaries of consequence. What would happen, they asked, if someone came forward now? Would it change anything? Would it matter? The answers were honest and devastating. No charges. No court. No absolution. Just confirmation of what was already believed. The inquiry ended there. Because confession, stripped of consequence, offered no relief. Only exposure. The absence of a body continued to shape every moral calculation. Without remains, the story could never fully settle into the category of murder in the public mind. Doubt persisted, clung to by those who needed it, exploited by those who preferred ambiguity to acceptance. The missing woman remained suspended between states, neither alive nor conclusively dead, a liminal presence that allowed denial to breathe. Investigators knew this liminality well. It was the same space cold cases always occupy, the uncomfortable middle where evidence points in one direction, but proof refuses to follow. In this case, that space had been inhabited for nearly 3 decades, growing familiar enough to become livable. Until it wasn't. The announcement had shattered that equilibrium. What had once been quietly endured now had to be actively managed. Silence required effort again. Avoidance demanded planning. The family learned that secrets age poorly, that time does not soften their edges, it sharpens them, turning them outward until they cut everyone nearby. The community felt that cut too. People began questioning old assumptions, not just about this case, but about others they had accepted without scrutiny. Missing persons notices resurfaced online. Unresolved deaths were discussed with renewed skepticism. Trust in simple explanations eroded. The idea that a case could be closed without justice seeded a broader unease, a suspicion that the system, while thorough, was ultimately limited by the same human instincts that enable crimes to remain hidden. This was the paradox Sydney 1995 left behind. The truth had been named, and yet the damage continued. Because truth without resolution does not settle. It destabilizes. In quiet moments, some investigators wondered whether reopening the case had done more harm than good. Whether exposing the secret had merely redistributed pain without offering relief. Others rejected that idea entirely, insisting that silence was its own violence, that allowing a lie to persist indefinitely was the greater harm. Both positions coexisted, unresolved. The case entered a new phase, not legally, but culturally. It became a reference point, a shared unease invoked whenever discussions turned to trust, family, and the limits of justice. It lingered in the background of conversations, a reminder that not all endings arrive cleanly, that some truths emerge only to reveal how little can be done with them. And through it all, the missing woman remained at the center, paradoxically present in her absence, defined by what had been taken from her and what had been denied to those who loved her. Her name appeared in articles, in debates, in whispers, but never attached to a place she could be mourned. No grave, no marker, no finality. Just a story that refused to rest. The cold case was closed. The secret was known. And the city learned, slowly, that exposure is not the same as release, that some revelations linger not as answers, but as questions that follow you home, sit quietly in the corner, and wait. As the noise faded and the headlines thinned, the case slipped into a quieter, more insidious phase, one where it stopped being discussed loudly and started being felt deeply, embedded in routines, shaping decisions in ways that were rarely acknowledged out loud. For those who had worked the review, the case became something they carried home. It crept into unrelated investigations, sharpening instincts, eroding patience for easy explanations. When a witness spoke too smoothly, someone thought of 1995. When a family closed ranks too quickly, someone remembered how cooperation can masquerade as innocence. The case didn't teach new procedures. It rewired old ones. You could see it in how questions were asked now, slower, narrower, less forgiving of consensus. You could hear it in the pauses investigators allowed to stretch, in their willingness to sit with discomfort rather than fill it. Sydney 1995 had become a lens, one that made ordinary scenes feel charged, potentially deceptive, waiting to be misread. Outside law enforcement, the story entered the private logic of everyday fear. Parents listened differently to arguments behind closed doors. Neighbors hesitated longer before dismissing strange noises as none of their business. People replayed their own histories, wondering what they had overlooked, what they had accepted too quickly because it was easier than imagining something darker. This wasn't paranoia. It was recalibration. The case suggested that danger doesn't always arrive loudly, that it can sound like family business, like stress, like a bad night everyone agrees to forget. It implied that the line between normalcy and catastrophe is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and that once crossed, it can be concealed with startling efficiency. For the family, time no longer moved forward cleanly. Each public mention dragged them backward, reactivating old tensions, reopening negotiations that had never truly ended. The youngest members, now adults, faced a question their parents had managed to avoid for decades. What does inheritance mean when it includes silence? Some chose distance, physical and emotional, leaving the city entirely, building lives where the story followed them only as rumor. Others stayed, tethered by obligation, guilt, or the quiet hope that endurance itself might someday feel like absolution. None of them found it. The missing woman's extended family lived with a different kind of ache. Without official charges, they were denied the rituals that follow conviction, the public acknowledgement of harm, the collective pause that allows grief to be shared. Their loss remained awkward, uncontainable, resurfacing in moments that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with its absence of resolution. They learned to mourn privately, carefully, aware that too much anger might be dismissed as bitterness, too much silence mistaken for acceptance. Their grief existed in a narrow corridor between belief and proof, respected by some, questioned by others, fully understood by no one. This was the human cost of closure without consequence. The city absorbed it unevenly. Some treated the case as finished, another tragedy filed away, an unsettling story to be recalled when convenient. Others couldn't let it go, returning to it compulsively, searching for a missing piece that would tip the balance from understanding to justice. Online, amateur investigators dissected timelines, argued over interpretations, mapped theories that grew increasingly elaborate as the absence of definitive answers demanded invention. The truth, simple and unbearable, struggled to compete with speculation. In the absence of a body, imagination flourished. Every construction site sparked rumors. Every stretch of bushland inspired questions. Each theory offered temporary relief, the comfort of imagining an ending, even a terrible one, rather than sitting with uncertainty. None of them satisfied for long. Investigators watched this from a distance, acutely aware that public speculation was both inevitable and dangerous. They knew how easily narratives harden, how quickly suspicion spreads beyond its source, contaminating lives that had nothing to do with the original act. They also knew they could do nothing to stop it. Once released, a story belongs to whoever needs it most. Privately, some revisited the evidence again, not because procedure required it, but because conscience did. They asked themselves whether there was one more angle, one more witness, one more overlooked anomaly that could justify reopening the case yet again. Each time, they reached the same conclusion. The truth was as complete as it was ever going to be. Incomplete. This was the final cruelty of the case. It offered clarity without completion. It told the city what had happened in broad strokes, but refused to provide the details that allow the mind to settle. It left too much unsaid, too much inferred, too much resting on belief rather than demonstration. And yet, belief reshaped behavior. The case changed how people talked about family, about loyalty, about the cost of keeping peace at any price. It challenged the reflex to protect insiders automatically, to assume that shared blood guarantees shared innocence. It suggested that sometimes the most dangerous agreements are the unspoken ones, the mutual understanding that certain questions will never be asked. As months passed, the story receded from public view, but not from public consciousness. It lingered as a low-grade anxiety, a background hum that surfaced whenever someone mentioned a missing person, whenever a case stalled, whenever a family insisted too strongly on unity. The cold case was closed. The city had adapted. And still, somewhere between memory and imagination, the woman at the center of it all remained unresolved, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder of what happens when truth arrives stripped of justice and silence learns how to survive exposure. She existed now as a question embedded in the city's fabric, unanswerable, persistent, impossible to ignore entirely. And in that persistence, the case continued to live. Time did what it always does after a revelation without resolution. It dulled the outrage, but sharpened the unease, turning the case into something less explosive and more corrosive, a slow-burning doubt that settled into the city's long-term memory. By now, the story was no longer framed as breaking news. It surfaced instead in anniversaries, in retrospective pieces, in quiet mentions that assumed the listener already knew the outline. The language shifted. Words like alleged and suspected gave way to implication, to a shared understanding that no longer needed careful qualifiers. The case had crossed an invisible threshold, from investigation to cautionary myth. And myths are harder to dislodge than facts. For those who had lived through the original disappearance, the passage of time brought no relief. Aging did not soften memory. It clarified it. People recalled details they had once dismissed as insignificant, the tone of a voice, the way someone avoided eye contact, the abruptness with which conversations had ended back then. These recollections arrived too late to be useful and too clearly to be ignored. Regret became a common refrain. Not regret for failing to solve the case, but regret for failing to ask better questions when it mattered. For trusting social norms over instinct. For believing that certain boundaries should not be crossed, even when something felt wrong. The case taught a brutal lesson: politeness can be an accomplice. Inside law enforcement, the case quietly altered training culture. Younger investigators were taught to resist narratives that resolved too cleanly, to interrogate harmony as rigorously as conflict. Sydney 1995 was referenced without detail, a shorthand example of how collective silence operates, how it spreads responsibility thin enough to become invisible. It also reignited debates about the purpose of closure. Was it meant to protect the integrity of the system? To offer truth to the public? Or to acknowledge that justice, as defined by law, sometimes fails to intersect with reality? The case offered no clear answer, only evidence that these goals can collide. For the family, life became an exercise in endurance. They existed in a state of permanent implication, never accused, never absolved. Every interaction carried the risk of recognition, of being silently associated with something they could not undo and would not publicly address. Their refusal to speak hardened perceptions, but speaking promised no salvation either. This was the trap the case had set. To remain silent was to appear guilty. To speak was to confirm the narrative. There was no version of the future that offered release. Some family members retreated into isolation. Others attempted normalcy with a determination that bordered on desperation. New routines were built, old ones abandoned. But the past remained stubbornly present, surfacing in moments of stress, in dreams, in unguarded reactions to certain questions. Silence, once a conscious choice, became reflex. The missing woman's name faded from daily conversation, but not from institutional memory. Advocacy groups continued to invoke her case when arguing for reforms, for better handling of missing persons, for long-term support for families left in limbo. She became representative of a category rather than an individual, a symbol of what happens when certainty arrives without consequence. That transformation carried its own violence. Because symbols are easier to discuss than people, and easier to forget. Every so often, a rumor would surface claiming new evidence, a witness finally ready to speak, a discovery that would change everything. Each time, hope flared briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. Nothing materialized. The pattern repeated until even speculation grew tired, until the absence of progress itself became expected. The city learned to live with the discomfort. This was perhaps the most disturbing outcome of all. Not that the case remained unresolved, but that it became normalized. That people adjusted to the idea that truth and justice could diverge so completely and still coexist. That a crime could be acknowledged without being punished and eventually lose its power to shock. Normalization did not mean acceptance. It meant adaptation. And adaptation is how unresolved harm persists. In quieter moments, some investigators admitted to a lingering fear that the case's legacy would not be reform, but resignation. That future disappearances might be met with the same patience for ambiguity, the same willingness to settle for understanding over accountability. Others believed the opposite, that Sydney 1995 would remain a warning sharp enough to prevent repetition. Both hopes rested on the same uncertainty. As the years passed, the house where it happened became just another address, stripped of context, its history known only to those who sought it out. Children played nearby. Life continued. The physical world moved on even as the narrative remained suspended, unresolved, intact. The absence of a body ensured that suspension would never fully break. Without remains, the story could not anchor itself in finality. It drifted instead, resurfacing unpredictably, refusing to settle into the past. The cold case was closed. The city had adapted. And the lesson it left behind remained as uncomfortable as ever. That knowing is not the same as justice. That exposure does not equal resolution. And that some truths, once uncovered, do not free us. They linger. They wait. And they remind us that the distance between what we accept and what we confront is often measured not in evidence, but in courage. By the time the case reached its 30th year, it had stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a condition, something woven so deeply into the city's subconscious that it no longer needed headlines to be remembered. It existed in the pauses between sentences, in the way people lowered their voices when the subject surfaced, in the collective instinct to glance away before the conversation went too far. The disappearance had become a reference point for unease. For investigators who had worked the review, the anniversary stirred a quiet reckoning. Some had moved on to other units, other cities, other lives, but the case followed them anyway, resurfacing whenever they encountered a family too unified, a story too neat. It reminded them that truth does not always reveal itself through confrontation, that sometimes it emerges only after patience has stripped away pretense and time has exhausted the energy required to maintain a lie. They spoke of the case less often now, but when they did, it was with a kind of reverence reserved for failures that teach more than successes ever could. Sydney 1995 had not ended in arrests or convictions, but it had permanently altered how they understood complicity, how it spreads quietly through relationships, how it can survive not through malice alone, but through agreement. Agreement to move on. Agreement not to ask. Agreement to let silence stand in for answers. Outside law enforcement, the story continued its slow transformation from shock to caution. Journalists revisiting the case framed it differently now, less focused on the mechanics of the disappearance and more on the implications it left behind. Articles explored how communities absorb unresolved harm, how narratives stabilize even when they lack justice, how people learn to live alongside truths they cannot fix. The tone was no longer outraged. It was unsettled. For the family, time had offered no refuge. Aging brought visibility rather than obscurity. Faces changed, names faded from memory, but association endured. Even those born after 1995 inherited the shadow, growing up aware that their surname carried weight, that certain questions would always follow them, even if no one asked them directly. This inheritance was the final cruelty of the case. A burden passed down without consent. A silence learned before its origin was understood. A legacy defined not by what was done, but by what was never acknowledged. Some family members attempted distance from one another, hoping separation might dilute suspicion. Others clung together more tightly, convinced that unity was the only defense left. Both approaches failed in different ways. Isolation amplified guilt. Togetherness amplified scrutiny. There was no configuration that allowed the past to loosen its grip. The missing woman's extended family marked the anniversary privately. No public statements. No appeals. Just remembrance carried out in ways that did not invite debate or disbelief. They had learned, painfully, that public grief can be contested, dissected, dismissed. Private mourning was safer, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. Their loss remained unresolved in a way language could not fully capture. Without remains, without a place to go, grief had nowhere to land. It hovered instead, persistent and uncontained, resurfacing in moments that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with its absence of finality. The city, too, had learned something about grief. It learned that communities can absorb unresolved stories and still function, that life continues even when justice does not arrive. It learned that exposure alone does not cleanse, that naming harm does not undo it. And perhaps most disturbingly, it learned how quickly discomfort can become familiar. This familiarity was not indifference. It was survival. But survival comes at a cost. The case left behind a subtle erosion of trust, a skepticism that settled into everyday interactions. People listened more carefully, questioned more quietly, hesitated longer before accepting simple explanations. The world felt slightly less safe, not because of what was proven, but because of what had been allowed to persist. As the 30th year closed, there was no ceremony, no official acknowledgement, no final word from authorities. The case remained exactly where it had been left, closed but unfinished, known but unresolved. It existed now as a boundary, a reminder of where the system ends and uncertainty begins. In that boundary, the case found its final form. Not a mystery to be solved, not a crime to be punished, but a truth to be carried. The cold case was closed. The secret was exposed. And the city continued forward, changed in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to deny. Because some stories do not end. They settle. They become part of the landscape. They shape how we see what comes next. And long after the last file is archived and the last headline fades, they remain, quietly asking the same question over and over again, not demanding an answer, but daring us to listen. In the end, there was no sound to mark the conclusion of the case. No gavel striking wood. No sirens cutting through the night. No final sentence delivered with certainty. The story did not end the way stories are supposed to. It simply went quiet, the way a room does after a difficult truth has been spoken and no one knows what to say next. The file sat on a shelf, its spine faded, its pages worn thin by decades of handling. It was officially closed, yet it carried a weight far heavier than most open cases ever would. Because closure, in this instance, did not mean resolution. It meant acceptance. Acceptance that some answers arrive too late to repair what they reveal. Acceptance that exposure is not the same as justice. Acceptance that knowing can hurt just as deeply as not knowing at all. For the investigators, there was a strange emptiness that followed. The pursuit had been long, relentless, defining. When it ended without arrests, without confessions, without courtroom drama, it left behind a hollow space where purpose had once lived. Some described it as relief. Others called it grief. Most could not name it at all. They only knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the case had taken more from them than time. They had uncovered the truth. But the truth had no destination. It could not be delivered to a judge. It could not be handed back to the family as compensation. It could not restore what had been erased in 1995. All it could do was exist. And existence, sometimes, is the heaviest burden of all. The family at the center of the secret learned this quickly. Once the truth was exposed, silence no longer protected them. It isolated them. Every interaction carried an unspoken undercurrent. Every gathering felt staged. Every moment tinged with the awareness that others were watching, measuring, remembering. Even those who had not participated in the original deception felt marked by it, trapped inside a narrative they had not chosen but could never escape. There were no villains left to confront. Only reflections. Some nights, the house where it all began still felt occupied by the past. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a psychological one. The walls held memories that could not be scrubbed away. The rooms echoed with conversations that had ended too abruptly, with decisions made in fear and sustained by habit. Time had moved forward, but the structure remained a container for everything that had been buried inside it. The missing woman's absence was no longer a question. It was a certainty shaped like a void. Her name appeared in records, in articles, in documentaries, but never in the present tense. She existed now only in fragments, remembered differently by different people, each version incomplete, each memory altered slightly by guilt, by love, by regret. She was not frozen in time. She was scattered across it. Her family continued to live with a grief that had no edge, no point of release. They had waited years for answers, believing that knowledge would bring peace, that exposure would bring relief. Instead, they found themselves standing in the aftermath of a truth that could not undo the loss, only reframe it. The pain did not lessen. It changed shape. And change can be just as difficult to survive. The community, too, carried its share of the aftermath. Sydney had absorbed the story into its collective memory, but memory is not neutral. It influences behavior. It shapes instinct. Parents held their children a little closer without realizing why. Neighbors listened more carefully to the sounds next door. People learned, subtly, that danger does not always announce itself, that it can wear familiar faces and speak in reassuring tones. The case became a lesson without a classroom, a warning without a conclusion. Years from now, new residents would move through the same streets unaware of the details, but not untouched by the atmosphere it left behind. Because places remember. Even when people forget specifics, the emotional residue lingers, shaping how a city breathes, how it responds to uncertainty, how it reacts when another name appears in another headline. Cold case. Missing. Unresolved. These words would surface again, attached to different faces, different years, different circumstances. But they would always echo back to 1995, to the moment when a secret was chosen over truth, and time was enlisted as an accomplice. And time, as it turns out, is very good at that role. It does not erase. It does not forgive. It only waits. The final irony of the case was this: the truth survived not because it was pursued aggressively, but because it was impossible to fully contain. It leaked through generations, through inconsistencies, through the quiet discomfort that settled over those who knew more than they said. The lie required maintenance. The truth required nothing at all. It simply endured. As the last reports were filed and the last interviews concluded, the case slipped out of active conversation and into something more permanent. A reference. A warning. A shadow that stretched long enough to touch the present. It no longer demanded attention. It commanded it silently. And somewhere within that silence, the unanswered questions remained. Not shouting. Not accusing. Just present. Because some stories do not end with justice. They end with awareness. And awareness, once awakened, cannot be undone. This was the legacy of the Sydney 1995 cold case. Not closure. Not peace. But a lasting unease that reminds us how easily truth can be delayed, how fragile certainty really is, and how the most devastating crimes are sometimes the ones that never fully come to light. The case was closed. The secret was exposed. And the echo of what was lost continued on, steady and unresolved, long after the city learned how to live with it. There is a moment after every ending when the mind refuses to accept that nothing more is coming. It lingers, listening for footsteps that will never return, for explanations that will never arrive. The Sydney 1995 cold case settled into that moment and stayed there, suspended, unresolved in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the city itself were holding its breath, unsure whether to exhale or keep the air locked inside its chest. Because endings without justice do not behave like endings. They behave like aftershocks. Long after the case was stamped closed, long after the last official statement was filed away and the final interview transcript archived, the consequences continued to ripple outward, touching people who had never known the victim, who had never met the family, who had only encountered the story in fragments, in passing references, in the uneasy tone of a conversation that changed direction too quickly. The case stopped being a story and became a lens, a way of interpreting other disappearances, other silences, other families who appeared too composed, too aligned, too practiced in their grief. Every new missing persons report carried an echo. And with each echo, the memory of 1995 stirred again. In police academies, the case found a second life. It was dissected not as a failure of procedure, but as a failure of imagination. Trainees were taught how easily investigators can be misled by cohesion, how unanimity can masquerade as truth, how the absence of contradiction can be more suspicious than chaos. The lesson was delivered quietly, without spectacle, because the case itself had taught them that the most dangerous deceptions are rarely dramatic. They are ordinary. They are familiar. They look like stability. The instructors never needed to name the family secret explicitly. It hovered between the lines, understood without being spoken. A reminder that sometimes the crime is not a single act, but a sustained agreement, reinforced day after day by routine, by fear, by the shared belief that preserving the present is worth sacrificing the past. Outside those classrooms, life moved on with a stubborn indifference that felt almost cruel. New buildings rose where old ones had stood. Streets were renamed. Cafes opened and closed. The city refreshed itself in ways that made the persistence of the case feel increasingly out of place, like a scar visible beneath new skin. But scars do not disappear. They adapt. Documentary crews returned periodically, each promising a new angle, a fresh perspective, a revelation that would finally tip the balance from suspicion to certainty. They interviewed neighbors who spoke in cautious tones, journalists who had covered the story in its earliest days, retired officers whose memories had softened at the edges, but not at the core. Each retelling added texture but not resolution. The mystery did not deepen. It calcified. For the woman at the center of it all, the passage of time did something strange. It reduced her presence while amplifying her absence. Photographs aged poorly, colors fading, faces blurring slightly, but the space she left behind grew more pronounced. She became less a person and more a question, less a life interrupted and more a symbol of what happens when truth is postponed indefinitely. She was remembered not for who she was, but for what her disappearance revealed. And that revelation was not about violence alone. It was about proximity. The idea that the most consequential harm often comes from those closest to us unsettled people far more than the possibility of a stranger. It disrupted the comforting narrative that danger is external, identifiable, removable. The Sydney 1995 case offered no such reassurance. It suggested instead that safety can be negotiated away quietly, that trust can be repurposed as a tool of concealment, that love and loyalty are not always barriers against wrongdoing, but sometimes its most effective camouflage. Families across the city felt this discomfort without always understanding its source. Arguments flared unexpectedly. Old grievances resurfaced. Questions that had been deferred for years demanded attention. The case acted like a mirror held too close, forcing reflection whether it was wanted or not. And reflection, like truth, is rarely gentle. Within the family bound to the secret, time continued its slow work of erosion. Relationships fractured under the strain of unspoken knowledge. Some members distanced themselves, physically and emotionally, believing that separation might dilute the weight they carried. Others remained bound together by a sense of shared fate, convinced that only those who understood the secret could truly understand each other. Neither path offered relief. The secret, once exposed, lost its protective function. It no longer shielded them from scrutiny or judgment. It became instead a permanent identifier, a context that preceded every interaction. Even moments of normalcy felt provisional, as if they could be revoked at any time by a reminder of what lay beneath. Children grew older and began to ask questions that had been carefully avoided. Why did people look at them differently? Why did their surname trigger hesitation? Why were certain topics forbidden, certain dates avoided? The answers, when they came, were incomplete, shaped by fear of causing further harm, by the belief that knowing too much too soon might replicate the damage already done. But children are perceptive. They sense absence. They feel tension. They inherit silence even when it is not explained. And so the secret continued its journey forward, no longer confined to a single generation, but distributed unevenly, reshaping identities, influencing choices, narrowing futures in ways that were subtle but profound. For the missing woman's relatives, the years after closure brought an unexpected complication. Sympathy shifted. Where once there had been unequivocal support, there was now nuance, hesitation, even doubt. Exposure complicated the narrative, introducing ambiguity where certainty had once lived. People struggled to reconcile compassion for loss with the discomfort of complicity, even indirect complicity. Grief, they learned, is easier to honor when it is uncomplicated. Still, they persisted in their remembrance, refusing to let the woman's identity be consumed entirely by the circumstances of her disappearance. They spoke of her humor, her stubbornness, her aspirations. They told stories that existed independently of the case, stories that did not require a mystery to be meaningful. In doing so, they reclaimed something essential. They reminded the world that before the cold case, before the headlines, before the secret, there was a person whose life mattered regardless of how it ended. This act of reclamation did not solve anything, but it restored balance. And balance, in the absence of justice, became a form of resistance. As the decades stretched on, the case began to blur with others, its specifics merging into a larger pattern of unresolved disappearances, each one reinforcing the next. Advocacy groups cited it as evidence of systemic limitations. Psychologists referenced it when discussing collective denial. Sociologists pointed to it as an example of how communities manage unresolved trauma. The case became useful, but usefulness did not equate to healing. Every so often, a tip would surface, usually vague, often unverifiable. A memory triggered by age. A confession hinted at but never completed. An object found and misidentified. Each time, a brief surge of attention followed, accompanied by cautious optimism, quickly extinguished by reality. The machinery of hope, once reactivated, shut down faster than before. And yet, people kept listening. Because unresolved stories create a peculiar addiction. They promise significance without closure, engagement without satisfaction. They invite speculation while withholding confirmation. The Sydney 1995 cold case offered just enough substance to sustain belief that something more might still emerge, that the final piece had simply been misplaced, waiting patiently to be discovered. This belief was not entirely irrational. Truth has a way of resurfacing unexpectedly. But as years turned into generations, the window for dramatic revelation narrowed. Witnesses aged. Memories degraded. Physical evidence, already scarce, deteriorated beyond usefulness. The case drifted from the realm of solvable mysteries into something more philosophical, a meditation on limits rather than a challenge to overcome. What, it asked, do we do with truths that arrive too late? How do we assign responsibility when accountability is no longer possible? What does justice look like when the system can only acknowledge, not act? These questions had no satisfying answers. They lingered instead, shaping discourse, influencing policy, haunting personal reflections. They forced a reconsideration of what closure really means and who it is meant to serve. The official declaration of closure had resolved administrative obligations, but it had not resolved the moral imbalance at the heart of the case. Perhaps it never could. As the city continued to evolve, new generations encountered the story for the first time, often through secondary sources, distilled versions stripped of context and emotional weight. For them, 1995 felt distant, almost abstract, another entry in a long list of unsolved crimes. Yet, even at a distance, the case retained its power. Because the core of it was timeless. Trust. Silence. Time. These elements recur in every era, under different guises, in different configurations. The Sydney 1995 case was not an anomaly. It was a concentration, a particularly clear demonstration of dynamics that operate quietly everywhere. And that clarity is what made it enduring. In the quiet moments, when attention drifted elsewhere and the city's pulse returned to its usual rhythm, the case persisted not as a demand, but as a presence. It reminded those who remembered it that certainty is fragile, that consensus can be constructed, that absence can be manufactured as effectively as it can occur. It taught, without intending to, that the most enduring crimes are not always those that shock at first contact, but those that settle into daily life unnoticed, sustained by routine and reinforced by fear of disruption. The Sydney 1995 cold case was no longer about solving a mystery. It was about understanding one. And understanding, unlike solving, does not end. It deepens. It complicates. It stays. So the story continues, not forward, but outward, influencing how people listen, how they doubt, how they resist the comfort of easy explanations. It exists now not in files or footage, but in the collective instinct to question cohesion, to examine silence, to remember that the absence of noise does not equal the presence of truth. The case is closed. The secret is known. But the lesson remains unfinished. And perhaps that is its final, unsettling gift. A reminder that some stories are not meant to conclude neatly, that their purpose lies not in resolution, but in the discomfort they leave behind, urging us to look harder, listen longer, and resist the urge to accept closure when what we are really being offered is forgetting. Time did not move on from the Sydney 1995 cold case the way people expected it to. It did not fade into obscurity or soften at the edges. Instead, it hardened, condensing into something quieter but heavier, like pressure building beneath a sealed surface. The case no longer needed reminders. It had embedded itself into instinct, into the way people reacted to silence, to consensus, to families who appeared too united in moments where fracture might have felt more honest. Years after the official closure, the case was rarely spoken aloud in full. It emerged instead in fragments, in half-sentences, in the pause that followed a mention of another disappearance. Detectives who had never worked it felt its influence anyway, absorbing its lessons secondhand, inheriting its caution. They learned to distrust harmony, to question narratives that arrived fully formed, to listen for what was missing rather than what was said. Because the Sydney case taught something fundamental. That the most effective lies are not told loudly. They are agreed upon quietly. In the neighborhoods where the story had first unfolded, memory lingered in subtle ways. People no longer pointed out the house or named the street, but they remembered the feeling. The sense that something was off long before anyone could articulate why. The discomfort that arrived early and stayed, ignored because it lacked evidence, dismissed because it lacked language. Discomfort, after all, is easy to override. Especially when doing so keeps life orderly. The family bound to the secret continued to age beneath the weight of exposure. Their lives did not collapse dramatically. There were no public breakdowns, no confessions spurred by guilt. Instead, there was attrition. Relationships thinned. Conversations shortened. Holidays became obligations rather than celebrations. The truth, once revealed, did not explode outward. It seeped inward, corroding intimacy from the inside. Trust within the family became conditional. What could be said? What could be remembered? What version of the past was safe to acknowledge? Some members tried to rewrite their personal histories, distancing themselves from the events of 1995, framing their lives as separate, unaffected. But history has a way of rejecting such edits. Others resisted separation entirely, clinging to shared identity as proof that the family still existed as a unit, still functioned despite everything. Functionality, however, is not the same as health. And health, like truth, cannot be sustained through denial indefinitely. The missing woman's name appeared less frequently in headlines now, but it never disappeared. It surfaced in academic papers, in discussions about institutional blind spots, in conversations about how investigations can be compromised not by corruption, but by courtesy. By the reluctance to disrupt a family. By the assumption that cohesion implies innocence. Her absence had become instructional. Yet instruction did not bring comfort. For those who loved her, the years after closure felt strangely disorienting. They had spent decades suspended in uncertainty, believing that answers would restore equilibrium, that exposure would validate their grief. When that exposure finally arrived without consequence, it left them standing in a space they had never prepared for. a truth with no remedy, a confirmation with no relief. They learned that grief does not end when questions are answered. It evolves. It demands reinterpretation. It asks the bereaved to integrate new information into memories that had already calcified, to reconcile love with suspicion, to remember without idealizing, to mourn without simplifying. This process was slow and lonely. The city watched from a distance, uncertain how to respond. Sympathy had become complicated. The narrative no longer fit neatly into categories of victim and villain. It required nuance, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Many chose not to. Discomfort, after all, asks something of us. It asks us to stay present. Instead, the case settled into the background hum of unresolved history, joining other stories that resist conclusion. It became a reference point rather than a focus, invoked when needed, then set aside. Its power lay not in constant attention, but in its persistence. Because persistence changes behavior. It shapes how people listen to the news, how they interpret silence, how they weigh consensus. Every time a family appeared too aligned, too prepared, too certain, someone remembered Sydney. Every time a disappearance was explained too quickly, someone hesitated. The case had rewired skepticism, embedding it into collective reflex. This was not cynicism. It was caution. And caution, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. In the years that followed, no new evidence emerged that could alter the case's status. No remains were found. No confession arrived fully formed. The truth, such as it was, remained conceptual rather than physical. It existed in inference, in alignment of behaviors, in patterns that pointed in one direction without ever arriving there. For some, this ambiguity was intolerable. For others, it was the only honest outcome. Because certainty, the case suggested, is often an illusion constructed after the fact. What mattered more was understanding how the illusion had been sustained. It had been sustained through repetition, through mutual reinforcement, through the shared belief that silence was safer than exposure. This belief did not originate in malice. It grew from fear. Fear of consequence. Fear of disruption. Fear of losing what little stability remained after the initial act that could never be undone. Fear, when shared, becomes powerful. It binds people together more tightly than truth ever could. The Sydney 1995 cold case was ultimately a study in that binding. In how fear can masquerade as loyalty, how protection can become complicity, how time can be weaponized not to heal, but to exhaust. The longer the secret endured, the harder it became to challenge, not because it was convincing, but because dismantling it required energy that few were willing to expend. Time did the rest. As witnesses aged and memories blurred, the possibility of accountability receded. What remained was acknowledgement, a muted recognition that something profoundly wrong had occurred and been absorbed rather than addressed. The system had not failed dramatically. It had failed quietly. And quiet failures are the hardest to confront. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand reform. They simply persist, shaping outcomes without drawing attention. The case left behind no villain to condemn, no trial to dissect, no verdict to debate. It left instead a set of questions that resisted closure. What do we owe the truth when it threatens stability? How much silence is too much? At what point does protection become harm? These questions lingered long after the case itself receded from view. They appeared in policy discussions, in ethical debates, in private moments of reflection. They influenced how people responded to future cases, how institutions evaluated family dynamics, how investigators interpreted unity. The legacy of the case was not resolution. It was recalibration. A subtle but lasting shift in how absence is understood, how silence is interpreted, how time is weighed not as a healer, but as a variable that can entrench harm as easily as it can erase pain. The Sydney 1995 cold case did not end with justice. It did not end with peace. It ended with awareness sharpened by discomfort. And perhaps that was the only ending it could offer. Because some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried forward, heavy and unresolved, reminding us that truth delayed is not truth denied, but truth transformed, altered by the years it spends waiting in the dark. The case remained closed. The secret remained known. And the city, changed by both, continued on, more cautious, more aware, and permanently marked by the knowledge that sometimes the most haunting crimes are not those that shatter lives instantly, but those that unfold slowly, sustained by silence, and revealed only when time has already taken almost everything else. The longer the case lived in the public consciousness, the more it began to resemble a low-frequency signal, always present, rarely noticed, impossible to fully tune out. It hummed beneath conversations, beneath policy debates, beneath the private calculations people made about whom to trust and when to ask questions that might change everything. The Sydney 1995 cold case had become less about a single disappearance and more about a shared unease, a recognition that some harms do not erupt, they accrue. This recognition altered behavior in ways that were difficult to measure. Investigators learned to sit with silence longer, to resist the pressure of tidy narratives. Journalists learned to read between quotes, to examine not just what was said, but what was conspicuously absent. Communities learned, slowly, imperfectly, that cohesion can be performative, that unanimity can be rehearsed, that the loudest reassurance sometimes masks the deepest fracture. These lessons did not arrive as doctrine. They arrived as instinct. In courtrooms across the city, judges referenced the case obliquely, invoking it as caution without naming it. In counseling rooms, therapists heard echoes of it in family dynamics shaped by secrecy and fear. In classrooms, students debated it as a case study in moral ambiguity, grappling with the uncomfortable reality that wrongdoing does not always announce itself with cruelty or chaos. Sometimes it wears the face of protection. Sometimes it speaks the language of love. The woman at the center of the case receded further into abstraction with each passing year. Her image survived in grainy stills and second-hand recollections, but her presence remained potent precisely because it was undefined. She existed now as a measure, a way to ask whether the systems designed to protect individuals are equipped to confront collective silence, whether accountability can survive when responsibility is distributed thinly across many hands. The answer, the case suggested, was uncertain. Within the family, the years after exposure brought a reckoning that no one had anticipated. The secret, once shared implicitly, began to fragment under scrutiny. People remembered events differently. Timelines drifted. Small contradictions surfaced, not enough to change outcomes, but enough to unsettle the internal mythology that had sustained them. The story they told themselves no longer aligned perfectly, and that misalignment created fissures. Some attempted reconciliation through honesty, offering partial truths as gestures of repair. Others retreated, convinced that reopening old wounds would only compound the damage. The family did not implode. It thinned. Connections loosened. What remained was a network held together more by history than by affection. History, however, is a powerful adhesive. It binds even when it hurts. For the missing woman's relatives, the passage of time demanded a different kind of courage. They learned to live without expectation, to mourn without anticipation of justice. They learned to tell her story without waiting for permission, to remember her without anchoring every memory to the unresolved. In doing so, they reclaimed agency over a narrative that had long been defined by absence. This reclamation did not erase the pain. It redistributed it. The community responded unevenly. Some leaned into the discomfort, engaging with the case as a mirror for broader societal issues. Others preferred distance, treating it as an artifact of another era, relevant but contained. Both responses were understandable. Neither fully addressed the residue the case had left behind. Residue is not loud. It accumulates. It shows up in policy hesitations, in funding decisions, in the cautious phrasing of official statements. It influences how institutions weigh the risk of confrontation against the comfort of consensus. The Sydney 1995 cold case did not cause these tendencies, but it illuminated them, casting light on vulnerabilities that had always existed. As years layered over the original event, the case began to resist linear telling. Chronology mattered less than pattern. Cause and effect blurred. What remained was a constellation of moments, choices made, questions deferred, silences maintained, that together formed a shape recognizable even when individual details faded. This shape was familiar to anyone who had witnessed unresolved harm. It was the shape of endurance. Endurance, in this context, was not heroic. It was pragmatic. It was the choice to keep going despite the knowledge that something essential had been lost and would not be returned. The city endured. The families endured. The truth endured, stripped of urgency but not of significance. Occasionally, someone would claim to have new information, a memory sharpened by age, a realization sparked by distance. These claims were handled gently now, with tempered expectations. The machinery of the investigation could still be activated, but it moved cautiously, aware of its own limitations. Each lead was assessed not for its promise of resolution, but for its potential to cause harm without delivering clarity. This recalibration marked a shift. The pursuit of truth had become an exercise in ethics as much as evidence. What is gained by reopening old wounds? Who benefits from renewed attention? At what point does investigation become intrusion? These questions had no universal answers. They were negotiated case by case, moment by moment, informed by the